Gunfire shattered the crystal chandeliers of Wellington's on Rush, raining glass onto the velvet booths. Delroy Wright, head of the city's most feared syndicate, was cornered, his men bleeding out on the marble floor. Death was seconds away. Then, the terrified waitress trembling behind the mahogany bar did the unthinkable. Snatching the discarded Glock from the floor, she didn't scream or run. She stood, aimed with terrifying precision, and pulled the trigger. Everything changed in that single heartbeat. Neon reflections bled across the wet asphalt of downtown Chicago, casting long, distorted shadows through the rain-streaked windows of Wellington's on Rush. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the bitter November chill. Jazz crooned softly from hidden speakers, mingling with the low hum of hushed conversations and the clinking of heavy crystal tumblers. This was an establishment built on discretion, a sanctuary for the city's elite, where politicians rubbed shoulders with men whose wealth came from shadows rather than boardrooms. Carolee Winslow adjusted the starched white apron tied around her waist, her amber eyes scanning her section of the dining room. At 26, Carolee was a ghost in this world of exorbitant wealth. She was a farm girl from a small, unforgiving town in rural Texas, raised by a gruff former Marine, Arthur Winslow, who had taught her that a steady hand and a sharp eye were a woman's best defense. She had moved to the city to pursue a culinary degree, a dream that had slowly suffocated under the crushing weight of student loans and sky-high rent. Now, she poured $1,000 bottles of Bordeaux for men who didn't bother to learn her name. It was honest work, and more importantly, it was quiet. That quiet shattered the moment the heavy mahogany double doors swung open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The maitre d', a usually unflappable Frenchman named Henri, visibly stiffened. 4 men walked in, but only one commanded the room: Delroy Wright. He moved with the predatory grace of a cornered wolf, his broad shoulders filling out a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Carolee's annual salary. Delroy was 34, with a jawline carved from granite and eyes the color of a bruised winter sky. He was the undisputed heir to the Wright crime family, a man who had violently stabilized his empire after the brutal assassination of his father 2 years prior. He didn't walk into a room, he annexed it. Flanking him were 3 men. Carolee recognized 2 from previous hushed visits: Luke Vargas, his sharply dressed right-hand man with a perpetually calculating gaze, and a massive, hulking enforcer named Thomas Callahan. The 3rd man was new, his eyes darting nervously around the room, a stark contrast to the veteran calm of the others. "Table 7, Carolee," Henri whispered, gliding past her, "and for God's sake, do not spill anything." Carolee nodded, wiping her hands on a bar towel. She grabbed a silver tray and approached the corner booth, an alcove shielded by high leather backing and heavy velvet curtains. It was the most secluded table in the restaurant, a tactical choice. "Good evening, gentlemen," Carolee said, her voice steady, betraying none of the nervous energy vibrating through the restaurant. "Can I start you with something from the bar?" Delroy didn't look up from the leather-bound menu immediately. He was tracing the embossed lettering with a thumb, a heavy gold signet ring catching the dim light. When he finally raised his eyes, Carolee felt a strange, cold jolt in her chest. His gaze was piercing, analytical, stripping away the polite veneer of the waitress to assess the threat beneath. Finding none, his expression remained an impenetrable mask. "Macallan 25, Delroy said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that barely carried over the jazz music. "Neat, 3 of them. Water for the kid." He gestured slightly to the nervous new guy. "Right away, sir," Carolee replied, turning sharply on her heel. As she prepared the drinks at the service bar, Carolee watched them in the antique mirror behind the liquor tiers. Delroy was leaning in, speaking in low, clipped tones. Luke Vargas was nodding, while Thomas Callahan kept his eyes firmly on the front entrance. There was a palpable tension radiating from the booth, a coiled spring ready to snap. Carolee had grown up around men preparing for war. Her father and his military buddies had carried that same heavy, suffocating aura. She knew violence when she smelled it. She delivered the drinks with mechanical precision, placing the heavy crystal glasses silently onto the white linen. Delroy didn't acknowledge her this time. He was too deeply engrossed in a fierce whispered debate with Luke. "Moretti is pushing his boundaries," Luke was saying, his voice a harsh whisper. "The docks are ours, Dom. If we let him take the shipping lanes, he'll choke our supply lines in a month." "Vincent Moretti is a rat, but he's a cautious rat," Delroy replied softly, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "He wouldn't make a move on the south side unless he knew we were overextended." Who talked? Carolee stepped back, practically melting into the shadows of the velvet curtains. She shouldn't be hearing this. The name Vincent Moretti was infamous in Chicago, a rival boss known for his absolute lack of a moral compass, a man who preferred public massacres to quiet assassinations. "I don't know who talked," Luke admitted, his jaw clenching. "But if Moretti thinks tonight is the night to test us—" "Let him try," Delroy said coldly. Carolee retreated to the kitchen, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She busied herself with polishing silverware, trying to shake the feeling of impending doom. The restaurant continued its polite, wealthy hum, oblivious to the fact that 2 blocks away, the gears of a gang war were grinding into motion. For the next hour, Carolee served them courses of dry-aged ribeye and truffled potatoes. Delroy ate sparingly, his eyes constantly scanning the room, dissecting every patron, every waiter, every busboy. Every time Carolee approached, she felt the weight of his stare, an uncomfortable hyper-awareness that made her skin prickle. He wasn't looking at her with the leering gaze of the other wealthy patrons. He was looking at her as a tactical variable. By 11:15 p.m., the dinner rush had thinned out. Only a few tables remained, occupied by lingering couples and tired businessmen. The jazz band had packed up, replaced by a soft, pre-recorded instrumental playlist. Carolee was standing behind the heavy brass and oak service bar, tallying up her receipts for the night, dreaming of her cramped apartment and her warm bed. She looked up at the mirror one last time. Delroy was leaning back in his booth, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He looked exhausted, the heavy burden of his empire temporarily etched into the lines around his eyes. For a fraction of a second, Carolee saw the man beneath the monster, a tired, isolated king sitting on a throne of knives. Then, the front doors exploded. The sound was deafening, a catastrophic boom that ripped the elegant oak doors from their brass hinges, sending heavy splinters of wood and shattered glass flying across the foyer. Henri, the maître d', didn't even have time to scream before the concussive wave threw him violently over his podium. Carolee dropped her receipt book, diving behind the thick oak of the service bar just as the first volley of automatic gunfire tore through the dining room. The sharp, terrifying crack, crack, crack of suppressed submachine guns drowned out the soft instrumental music. Crystal chandeliers exploded into a million lethal diamonds, raining down on the screaming patrons. "Down! Get the hell down!" Delroy's voice roared over the chaos, a command that cut through the panic with terrifying authority. From her cramped hiding spot behind the bar, Carolee peered through the narrow gap between the liquor displays. 6 men in heavy black tactical gear and Kevlar masks were swarming through the shattered entrance. They moved with military precision, fanning out and directing their fire squarely at Table 7. Vincent Moretti hadn't just sent a message, he had sent a hit squad. Delroy Wright was not a man who died easily. Before the first bullet reached their booth, he had already moved. With a massive surge of strength, he kicked the heavy oak dining table upward, flipping it onto its side to create a makeshift barricade. Thick porcelain plates shattered, and the remaining Macallans soaked into the plush carpet. Thomas Callahan drew a heavy pistol from beneath his jacket and stepped out from behind the table, firing blindly to cover Delroy. He managed to drop one of the masked gunmen with a shot to the chest, but the return fire was devastating. 3 assailants focused on the giant enforcer, their bullets tearing through his torso. Thomas collapsed backward, crashing into a serving cart in a spray of blood and silver platters. "Tommy!" Luke Vargas shouted. He leaned around the edge of the overturned table, returning fire with a compact Glock, but the gunmen were advancing methodically, trapping them in the corner. "We need a bottleneck. Move to the bar," Delroy ordered, his voice remarkably calm amidst the slaughter. He drew his own weapon, a sleek Sig Sauer P226, and laid down a barrage of covering fire. Carolee squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears as bullets shredded the expensive liquor bottles directly above her head. Bourbon, vodka, and gin rained down on her, soaking her uniform, the sharp fumes burning her nose and eyes. The restaurant had become a war zone. The screaming of the patrons had turned into a horrifying wet silence, save for the relentless roar of gunfire. "Move," Delroy bellowed. Carolee heard the heavy thud of boots on the marble floor. She opened her eyes just as Delroy and Luke dove behind the service bar, sliding across the slick alcohol-covered floor and crashing into the brass ice bins beside her. Luke was bleeding heavily. A stray bullet had caught him in the shoulder, tearing through his expensive suit jacket. He slumped against the cabinetry, gasping, his gun hand trembling violently. Delroy knelt beside him, his face a mask of cold fury. He checked Luke's wound, ripping a linen napkin from the counter and pressing it hard into the torn flesh. "Hold that," Delroy ordered, his eyes darting to the ends of the bar. They were trapped. The service bar was a dead end, boxed in by the kitchen doors, which had been blown shut by the crossfire. Delroy looked down and finally noticed Carolee. She was curled into a tight ball by the industrial dishwasher, drenched in top-shelf liquor, her apron stained with shattered glass. Her amber eyes were wide with terror, but she wasn't screaming. She was breathing in deep, measured counts. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Her father's training was fighting against her panic. "Stay low, sweetheart," Delroy grunted, racking the slide of his Sig Sauer. "If you value your life, you fuse yourself to this floor." He didn't wait for an answer. Delroy popped up over the brass railing, firing 3 rapid shots. A scream echoed from the dining room as one of Moretti's men went down, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. The remaining 4 hitmen realized their targets were pinned. "Flank them! Take the kitchen side!" one of the masked men shouted. Heavy boots crunched on broken glass, moving closer. Carolee's heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. The smell of copper, cordite, and spilled alcohol was suffocating. She looked at Luke, who was turning a dangerous shade of pale, his eyes rolling back. Delroy dropped his empty magazine onto the floor with a metallic clatter. He reached into his jacket for a spare, his hands moving with practiced speed. He slammed the fresh magazine home, leaning around the edge of the bar to shoot down the flanker. A deafening blast shattered the wood right next to Delroy's head. The force of the close-range shotgun blast threw him backward. He didn't take the bullet, but a massive chunk of splintered oak caught him square in the temple. Delroy crashed onto his back, his head bouncing off the tiled floor. His vision blurred, a sickening ringing filling his ears. The Sig Sauer slipped from his grasp, sliding across the wet floor, coming to a dead stop mere inches from Carolee's shaking knees. "Dom!" Luke choked out, unable to raise his weapon. Delroy tried to sit up, but the concussion grounded him. Blood poured down the side of his face, blinding his left eye. He reached blindly for his gun, his fingers scraping uselessly against the wet tile. He was out of time. Footsteps rounded the corner of the bar. A massive hitman in black tactical gear stepped into the service area, pumping a tactical shotgun. He looked down at the bleeding, disoriented Mafia Boss, and a cruel, triumphant smile stretched beneath his Kevlar mask. "Moretti sends his regards, right?" the hitman growled, racking a fresh slug into the chamber and aiming the barrel directly at Delroy's chest. Delroy gritted his teeth, refusing to look away, bracing for the thunder. But the thunder never came. Time dilated, stretching the frantic seconds into agonized, slow-motion frames. Carolee stared at the black steel of the Sig Sauer resting against her knee. In the span of a single heartbeat, the terrified waitress vanished, replaced by the ghost of Sergeant Arthur Winslow's daughter. She didn't think. Thinking would get her killed. Muscle memory, drilled into her on dusty Texas ranges since she was 10 years old, hijacked her nervous system. Carolee's hand shot out, her fingers wrapped around the textured grip of the Sig Sauer. The weapon was heavy, perfectly balanced, and cold to the touch. In one fluid, seamless motion, she rose from a crouch to a tactical kneel. Her left hand cupped her right, forming a flawless textbook weaver stance. The hitman didn't even notice her. He was too focused on his prize, too confident in his victory. He never saw the waitress raise the weapon. Carolee aligned the tritium night sights, placing the glowing green dot squarely on the narrow gap between the hitman's Kevlar vest and his throat guard. She breathed out, emptying her lungs to steady her hands. She pulled the trigger. Crack, crack, a double tap, flawless, devastating. The heavy 9mm hollow points tore through the air. The first round struck the hitman dead center in the exposed throat. The second caught him under the jawline as his head snapped back. The tactical shotgun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, blowing a massive hole in the plaster as the colossal man crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings violently severed. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and profound. The only sound was the metallic tink of Carolee's 2 spent brass casings bouncing across the floor tiles. Delroy, still on his back with blood pouring into his eye, stared at her. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't happening. Waitresses didn't hold firearms with perfect tactical discipline. Waitresses didn't drop professional killers with ice-cold precision. Carolee remained frozen in her stance, her amber eyes locked on the lifeless body of the hitman. The gun in her hands was perfectly steady, smoke drifting lazily from the barrel. For a moment she looked like an avenging angel amidst the ruins of the upscale restaurant. "Jesus Christ," Luke breathed from the corner, his hand pressing into his bleeding shoulder. The sound of Luke's voice snapped the spell. The reality of what she had just done crashed over Carolee like a freezing tidal wave. Her hands suddenly began to shake violently. She lowered the gun, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake, a horrified gasp tearing from her throat. They have friends," Delroy rasped, fighting through the concussion to drag himself up. He grabbed the edge of the brass sink, pulling himself to his feet. He looked at Carolee, his dark eyes burning with an intense, complicated mixture of shock and profound calculation. "How many?" "3, Carolee whispered, her voice trembling, the Texas drawl she usually suppressed slipping out. "3 left out there." "Give me the gun," Delroy said, holding out his hand. Carolee looked at him, then at the gun. She hesitated, her survival instincts warring with her common sense. She had just killed a man. She was in the middle of a mafia war. She didn't know if handing over the weapon was suicide. "I won't hurt you," Delroy said, his voice dropping an octave, softening just enough to cut through her panic. "You just saved my life. But if we want to keep living, you have to give me the gun." Slowly, she flipped the weapon and handed it to him, grip first. Delroy checked the chamber, wiping the blood from his eye with the back of his sleeve. "Through the kitchen," Carolee said suddenly, grabbing her receipt book out of pure, irrational habit before dropping it again. "There's an alley exit. It leads to a service tunnel. They won't know it's there." Delroy nodded, hauling Luke to his feet. "You hear that, Luke? We're taking the scenic route." He looked back at Carolee. "Lead the way. Do not stop running." Carolee didn't need to be told twice. She bolted toward the heavy stainless steel swinging doors of the kitchen. Delroy followed, keeping his body between her and the dining room, firing 2 blind suppression shots over the bar to keep Moretti's men pinned down. They burst into the cavernous kitchen. It was empty. The staff had long since fled at the first sound of gunfire. Pots of boiling water still hissed on the industrial stoves, filling the air with heavy, humid steam. Carolee navigated the maze of prep stations flawlessly, her non-slip shoes gripping the greasy floor. Behind them, the dining room erupted again. The remaining hitmen realized their prey was escaping. "They're moving!" a muffled voice yelled from the front. Carolee slammed her shoulder into the heavy reinforced steel door at the back of the kitchen, throwing her weight against the push bar. The door flew open, dumping them into the freezing, rain-swept alleyway behind Wellington's. The sudden blast of cold November air was a shock to the system, instantly sobering. The alley was pitch black, lit only by the flickering amber glow of a distant street lamp. Carolee turned left, sprinting toward a rusted chain-link fence. "Over here!" she hissed, pointing to a heavy iron grate set into the concrete. "It's an old coal chute, connects to the basement of the abandoned theater next door." Delroy grunted, practically carrying Luke. He set his wounded capo down against the brick wall and grabbed the heavy iron handle of the grate. With a roar of exertion, he heaved it upward. The hinges screamed in protest, but the grate swung open, revealing a pitch-black abyss. "Go!" Delroy ordered, pushing Carolee toward the hole. "Ah, I'm not going down there first," she protested, terrified of the dark. "You want to stay up here and explain things to Moretti's men?" Delroy snapped, raising his gun as the heavy steel door of the kitchen began to bang open. Carolee swallowed her fear, sat on the edge, and slid down into the darkness. She landed hard on a pile of dusty canvas sacks, choking on the immediate smell of mildew and rot. A second later, Luke dropped down beside her, groaning loudly as his wounded shoulder hit the ground. Delroy was the last to descend. He grabbed the iron grate from the inside, pulling it shut just as the kitchen doors burst open above them. The heavy grate clanged shut, locking them in total, suffocating darkness. Above them, heavy boots pounded on the concrete alleyway. Flashlight beams cut through the grating, sweeping wildly over the iron bars, casting prison-like shadows across Carolee's terrified face. She clamped a hand over her own mouth to stifle her panicked breathing. Delroy pressed himself against the damp brick wall next to her. In the terrifying dark, his large, calloused hand found hers. He didn't say a word, but his grip was ironclad, pulling her flush against his chest to keep her completely hidden from the flashlight beams above. "They're gone!" a voice shouted from the alley. "Check the street!" The footsteps receded, fading into the ambient noise of the Chicago rain. Carolee let out a shaky breath, her adrenaline crashing violently. She was trapped in an underground coal chute with a bleeding mafia capo and the most dangerous crime boss in the city. Delroy finally let go of her hand, pulling a small silver lighter from his pocket. He flicked it open, the small flame illuminating his blood-stained face. He looked at Carolee, really looked at her. Her apron was shredded, her hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat and spilled gin, and her hands were still trembling. "What the hell's a waitress doing shooting like a Navy SEAL?" Delroy asked quietly, the flame flickering in his bruised, intelligent eyes. Carolee wiped the grime from her face, leaning back against the cold stone. "My dad was a Marine," she whispered. Delroy stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The calculation in his eyes had shifted into something else, respect, and something far more dangerous, ownership. "Well, Carolee," Delroy said softly, closing the lighter with a sharp snap and plunging them back into darkness, "you're not a waitress anymore." Cold dampness clung to the rotting brick walls of the subterranean passage, smelling intensely of oxidized iron and forgotten decades. Delroy kept his silver lighter raised, the tiny flame casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the arched ceiling. He moved with a brutal, single-minded focus, his left arm wrapped securely around Luke Vargas's waist, dragging the wounded capo forward. Carolee followed closely, her non-slip work shoes splashing through shallow puddles of stagnant water. Her mind was a fractured kaleidoscope of the last 20 minutes, the deafening roar of the shotgun, the heavy recoil of the Sig Sauer snapping against her wrists, the terrifying, lifeless gaze of the man she had killed. A violent shiver racked her spine, and she crossed her arms tightly over her chest, trying to hold herself together. "Dom!" Luke gasped, his voice a wet, ragged wheeze. "I'm slowing you down. Leave me. I can hold the tunnel if they find the grate." "Shut up, Luke," Delroy growled, hauling the man up a short flight of crumbling concrete stairs. "You're not dying in a rat-infested basement. We're 5 minutes from the extraction point." "They knew exactly where we were," Luke coughed, a thin line of crimson trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Someone in our inner circle sold us out to Moretti. We will butcher the rat when we find him," Delroy said, his baritone voice echoing off the curved ceiling with chilling finality. "Right now you focus on breathing." Carolee watched the exchange with mounting horror. These men discussed betrayal and murder with the casual annoyance most people reserved for a flat tire. She had spent her life scraping by, serving steaks to these phantoms of Chicago's underworld, pretending not to see the holstered weapons bulging beneath their tailored jackets. Now she was buried in the dark with them, her hands stained with the same violence. "Where are we going?" Carolee asked, her voice cracking slightly in the cavernous dark. Delroy didn't turn around. "Underneath the theater district. My grandfather used these tunnels during Prohibition to move liquor from the rail yards. Most of the city forgot they exist. We maintain a few of them for emergencies." "I need to go home," Carolee said, the reality of her situation finally piercing through the shock. "I have a cat to feed. I have a morning shift at the bakery. I need to go home, pretend this never happened," and Delroy stopped abruptly. He lowered Luke gently against the damp brick wall and turned to face her. The lighter fluid was running low, the flames sputtering and casting harsh demonic angles across his bruised face. "Carolee," Delroy said softly, stepping closer. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. He smelled of expensive scotch, gunpowder, and copper. "You don't have a home anymore, not tonight." "You can't kidnap me," she fired back, a spark of Texas defiance finally igniting in her chest. "I saved your life. And by doing so, you ended yours," Delroy stated, devoid of malice, offering only cold surgical truth. "Moretti's men aren't street thugs. They're cartel-trained professionals. The ones who survived saw your face. They saw you drop their point, man. By tomorrow morning, Vincent Moretti will know exactly who you are, where you live, and who your family is. If you walk out of this tunnel and go back to your apartment, you will be dead before sunrise." Carolee felt the air evacuate her lungs. "No, I'm just a waitress. I have nothing to do with this." Delroy reached out, his large calloused fingers gently gripping her chin, tilting her face up to meet his intense gaze. "You killed a mageman of the Moretti family to save the head of the Wright syndicate. In their eyes, you are a Wright now. You belong to me." The possessive weight of his words sent a dangerous thrill down her spine, terrifying her more than the gunfire had. She tried to pull away, but his grip, though gentle, was immovable. "I don't belong to anyone," she whispered fiercely. "You do if you want to breathe tomorrow," Delroy replied, his thumb brushing a smudge of soot from her cheekline. "I protect my own. You are under my protection now, understand?" Before Carolee could formulate a response, the tunnel dead-ended into a massive, heavily reinforced steel door. Delroy let go of her chin, much to her immediate relief, and punched a 6-digit code into a rusted keypad hidden behind a loose brick. The heavy locking mechanisms disengaged with a series of loud industrial clanks. He pushed the door open, revealing a hidden subterranean parking garage, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. Parked in the center of the concrete expanse was a sleek, armored, pitch-black Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. "Get the back door open," Delroy ordered, hoisting Luke back onto his feet. Carolee rushed forward, pulling the heavy handle of the SUV. The interior smelled of rich leather and antiseptic. Delroy maneuvered Luke into the back seat, pressing a thick trauma pad against his capo's bleeding shoulder. "Get in the front," Delroy barked at Carolee, sliding into the driver's seat. She didn't argue. She climbed into the passenger seat, buckling her seatbelt with trembling hands. Delroy hit a button on the overhead console, and a massive concrete ramp ahead of them began to slowly rise, revealing the rain-slicked streets of a dark, abandoned industrial district. The G-Wagon roared to life, the massive V8 engine echoing violently in the concrete bunker. Delroy slammed the vehicle into gear and tore up the ramp, bursting out into the stormy Chicago night. He drove with terrifying precision, taking tight corners at breakneck speeds, weaving through the abandoned warehouse district to lose any potential tails. Carolee stared out the window, watching the neon blur of the city she thought she knew. Her modest apartment, her culinary textbooks, her quiet, struggling life. It was all gone, erased by a single squeeze of a trigger. She glanced over at Delroy. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white around the steering wheel, blood still drying on the side of his handsome face. He was a monster, but right now he was the only monster keeping her alive. Morning sunlight failed to pierce the heavy, oppressive storm clouds suffocating the Chicago skyline. Carolee sat on the edge of a massive California king bed, staring blankly at the sprawling, chaotic cityscape visible through the floor-to-ceiling bulletproof windows. They were in a penthouse high above the Gold Coast, an impenetrable fortress disguised as a luxury residence. The space was a masterpiece of modern minimalism, dark mahogany, brushed steel, and imported Italian leather. It was cold, beautiful, and utterly terrifying. Down the hall, the muffled sounds of a makeshift surgery were winding down. Dr. Harrison Miller, a brilliant surgeon who had lost his license to gambling debts and found salvation on the right payroll, had arrived 20 minutes after they pulled into the underground garage. He had successfully extracted the bullet from Luke's shoulder and stitched the gaping laceration on Delroy's temple. Carolee looked down at her hands. They were scrubbed raw. She had spent an hour in the massive slate-tiled rainfall shower, aggressively scrubbing the smell of gunpowder, spilled liquor, and death from her skin. But the scent seemed embedded in her pores. A soft knock on the bedroom door broke her trance. The door clicked open, and Delroy stepped inside. He had changed out of his ruined suit, wearing a simple black V-neck t-shirt and dark jeans that accentuated his broad, muscular build. A neat white bandage was taped over his left temple, contrasting sharply with his dark, tousled hair. Without the tailored armor of his bespoke suits, he looked less like an untouchable crime lord and more like a dangerously attractive, lethal predator. He held a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and a stack of folded clothes in the other. "Drink," Delroy commanded softly, placing the mug on the glass nightstand beside her. He set the clothes next to it. "My housekeeper keeps spares here. They might be a little loose, but it beats wearing a blood-soaked apron." "How is Luke?" Carolee asked, her voice raspy. She pulled the plush terry-cloth bathrobe tighter around her waist, suddenly hyper-aware of her vulnerability. "He'll live," Delroy said, leaning against the doorframe, his dark eyes studying her intently. "Miller gave him enough morphine to knock out a draft horse. He's sleeping it off in the guest wing." "And you?" she asked, gesturing vaguely to his bandaged head. "I've had worse headaches," he replied dismissively. He crossed the room, his footsteps completely silent on the thick Persian rug, and stopped mere inches from where she sat on the edge of the bed. The proximity was electric. Carolee could feel the heat radiating off him. She looked up, her amber eyes locking onto his stormy, bruise-colored gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with unspoken questions and lingering adrenaline. "I pulled your file while you were in the shower," Delroy said quietly, shattering the silence. Carolee bristled, her back straightening. "My file? I have men who can find out everything about a person with a single phone call," Delroy explained, sea-righting his arms. "Carolee Winslow, raised in Odessa, Texas. Father was a Force Recon Marine, honorable discharge, died of a heart attack 3 years ago. You moved here to attend Le Cordon Bleu, but dropped out when the tuition got too steep. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket." "Congratulations!" Carolee spat, anger finally burning through her exhaustion. "You know how to use Google. Invading my privacy doesn't give you the right to keep me here." "I told you, you're here because you're a target." Delroy's voice remained impossibly calm, which only infuriated her more. "Moretti hit my men at Wellington's because he knew I'd be vulnerable. He bribed someone close to me. Until I find out who that is, nobody leaves this penthouse, not me, not Luke, and certainly not you." Carolee stood up, refusing to cower, even though he towered over her by a good 8 inches. "I don't care about your mafia politics, Delroy. I am not a soldier in your war. I defended myself. I defended you. Now let me go." Delroy's expression hardened. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing Carolee to back up until her calves hit the edge of the mattress. He reached out, his hand resting heavily on the wall directly beside her head, boxing her in. "You think this is a movie, Carolee?" he whispered, his face inches from hers. "You think you can just shoot a cartel-trained hitman in the throat, dust off your hands, and go back to baking croissants? Vincent Moretti is a psychopath. He skins his enemies alive. He will find you. He will torture you to send a message to me, and then he will kill you." Carolee's breath hitched. She stared into his eyes, looking for any trace of a bluff, but found only grim, absolute certainty. "I owe you my life," Delroy continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. "In my world, a debt of blood is the only currency that matters. I am not keeping you here as a prisoner, Carolee. I am keeping you here because if you walk out that door, you are a dead woman walking. I will not let the woman who saved my life be slaughtered on the street." He was so close, she could feel the warmth of his breath on her collarbone. The anger inside her warred with a terrifying, undeniable attraction. He was a ruthless killer, a criminal kingpin, yet in his eyes she saw a fierce, uncompromising need to protect her. "So what happens now?" Carolee asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Now," Delroy said, slowly stepping back, giving her room to breathe, "we prepare for war, and you stay exactly where I can see you." Rain hammered relentlessly against the reinforced glass of the penthouse, creating a rhythmic drumming that did little to soothe Carolee's frayed nerves. 2 days had passed since the bloodbath at Wellington's on Rush. For 48 hours, she had been a ghost, haunting a multi-million-dollar fortress, pacing the sprawling hardwood floors in oversized cashmere sweaters and borrowed leggings. The outside world had been entirely severed. Delroy had confiscated her phone the moment Dr. Miller finished stitching him up, citing the risk of GPS tracking and intercepted signals. To keep herself from spiraling into a panic attack, Carolee turned to the only sanctuary she had left: the kitchen. Delroy's kitchen was a masterclass in culinary excess, outfitted with professional-grade Viking appliances, gleaming copper pots hanging from a wrought iron rack, and a walk-in pantry stocked like a high-end European delicatessen. It was a space designed for a private chef, but for the past 2 days it had become Carolee's domain. Chopping, sautéing, and reducing sauces gave her hands something to do, and her mind a temporary reprieve from the terrifying reality of her imprisonment. She was in the middle of searing a perfectly marbled ribeye, the kitchen heavy with the rich aroma of butter, rosemary, and crushed garlic when Delroy walked in. He looked exhausted. The sharp lines of his face were shadowed by a dark stubble, and his tie hung loosely around his neck. He had spent the last 2 days locked in his study, coordinating a brutal defensive perimeter across his territories and hunting for the leak that had nearly gotten them killed. Delroy didn't say a word. He simply pulled out a heavy oak stool at the marble island and sat, watching her work. The intense, predatory gaze that usually unsettled her was softer now, replaced by a deep, weary appreciation. Carolee wordlessly transferred the steak to a cutting board, letting it rest before slicing it into thin, perfect strips. She plated it alongside a vibrant arugula salad, dressed with lemon and shaved parmesan, sliding the dish across the cool marble toward him. "You haven't eaten since yesterday morning," Carolee said, her voice quiet but firm. "Even crime bosses need protein." A faint, tired smile tugged at the corner of Delroy's mouth. "Thank you," he murmured. He took a bite, closing his eyes for a brief second. "My God, you might actually be a better cook than my grandmother, and if my capos heard me say that, they'd have me whacked for blasphemy." "It's just a good sear," Carolee deflected, drying her hands on a linen towel. The domestic intimacy of the moment felt jarringly out of place. Here she was, feeding a man responsible for God knew how many bodies, and yet watching him eat brought her a strange, unsettling comfort. "It's more than that," Delroy said, looking up at her. "You bring order to chaos, Carolee. I saw it at the restaurant when you picked up that gun, and I see it now. You adapt." Before Carolee could respond, the heavy steel doors of the private elevator chimed. The warmth evaporated from the room in a millisecond. Delroy's hand immediately dropped to the holstered weapon at his waist, his body shielding Carolee by pure instinct. The doors slid open to reveal Luke Vargas, his left arm secured in a black sling. Behind him, 2 massive enforcers were dragging a bruised, terrified man by the collar of his shirt. It was Jimmy, the nervous new recruit who'd been sitting at their table at Wellington's before the shooting started. "We found the rat," Luke announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. He shoved Jimmy forward, causing the young man to collapse onto the pristine hardwood floor of the living room, weeping openly. Delroy stepped out of the kitchen, his entire demeanor shifting. The tired, appreciative man who had just praised her cooking vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless apex predator of the Chicago underworld. He stalked toward Jimmy, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Carolee stayed behind the marble island, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew she should look away, retreat to her bedroom, and shut the door, but her feet were rooted to the floor. "Dom, I swear to God," Jimmy sobbed, scrambling backward until his spine hit the base of a leather sofa. "They forced me. Moretti's guys, they grabbed my sister coming out of nursing school. They said if I didn't tell them where you were having dinner, they were going to put her in a shipping container." Delroy stood over the trembling young man, a dark, immovable monolith. He didn't yell. He didn't strike him. The quietness of his fury was infinitely more terrifying. "You broke the oath, Jimmy," Delroy said softly, the baritone of his voice carrying a lethal finality. "If they took your sister, you should have come to me. We would have burned Moretti's operation to the ground to get her back. But instead, you sold me out. You sold Tommy out. Tommy is in a morgue because of you." "Please!" Jimmy shrieked, clutching at Delroy's pant leg. "Please, Dom, they still have her. They said they'd let her go if I gave them the time of the meeting, but they lied. You have to help me." Delroy stared down at the traitor for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, broken only by Jimmy's pathetic gasps for air. "Where is she?" Delroy finally asked. "The old rail yards," Jimmy choked out, hope desperately flaring in his eyes. "Warehouse 4, that's where they make their drops. Dom, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." "Luke," Delroy said, not breaking eye contact with the weeping man on the floor. "Yeah, boss," Luke answered, stepping forward. "Take a team to Warehouse 4, retrieve Jimmy's sister, put a bullet in anyone wearing Moretti's colors." Jimmy collapsed forward, sobbing in pure relief. "Thank you, Dom. Thank you. I swear I'll make it up to you. I swear on my life." "I know you will," Delroy interrupted, his voice dropping to a glacial whisper. He drew the suppressed Sig Sauer from his waistband in a blur of motion. Carolee gasped, clapping her hands over her mouth. Delroy didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. A muted thwip echoed through the massive living room. Jimmy's head snapped back, a small, dark hole appearing directly between his eyes. He slumped sideways, dead before he hit the Persian rug. "Get this garbage out of my house," Delroy ordered his enforcers, holstering his weapon without a second glance, "and bleach the floor." He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Carolee in the kitchen. She was trembling violently, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the marble counter. She had killed a man in self-defense in the heat of a chaotic firefight. But this cold, calculated execution was an entirely different species of violence. Delroy walked back toward the kitchen, stopping just on the other side of the island. He looked at her pale face, his jaw clenched tight. "That is the world you are in now, Carolee," he said, his voice laced with a bitter, uncompromising honesty. "Betrayal is paid in blood, always." Smoke from a distant fire hung low over the Chicago skyline, turning the morning sun into a hazy, blood-orange disk. Carolee stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her fingers lightly pressing against the cold glass. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jimmy slumping onto the rug, the brutal efficiency of Delroy's justice playing on a terrifying loop in her mind. The penthouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully decorated tomb. Behind her, the heavy doors of Delroy's study swung open. He walked out, his face drawn tight, gripping a tablet so hard his knuckles were white. Luke followed closely behind, his arm still in the sling, looking equally grim. "They hit the bakery," Delroy said, skipping any preamble. Carolee turned around so fast she nearly lost her footing. "What?" 20 minutes ago, Delroy continued, his voice devoid of its usual smooth control. Two men in ski masks tossed incendiary devices through the front window of Sweet Traditions on 4th Street. The place went up in minutes. Carolee felt the floor drop out from underneath her. Sweet Traditions, the small family-owned bakery where she worked her morning shifts. It was owned by Mrs. Gable, a sweet elderly widow who had treated Carolee like a granddaughter, slipping her extra cash in envelopes when tips were low. "Mrs. Gable," Carolee choked out, the air fleeing her lungs. "Was she inside? Oh my God, please tell me she wasn't inside." Delroy stepped forward, his eyes softening slightly at the sight of her panic. "She was prepping the morning dough. The fire department pulled her out. She's at Chicago Med. Severe smoke inhalation and second-degree burns, but the doctors say she will pull through." A sob tore through Carolee's throat. Her knees buckled, the weight of the guilt finally crushing her. She collapsed toward the floor, but Delroy was there instantly, his strong arms catching her before she hit the hardwood. He pulled her flush against his chest, wrapping his arms securely around her trembling frame. "It's my fault," Carolee wept into his shirt, her fingers clutching the dark fabric. "She's an innocent old woman, Delroy. Moretti targeted her because of me, because I pulled that trigger." "No," Delroy said fiercely, his hand resting on the back of her head, pressing her closer to the steady beating of his heart. "Moretti targeted her because he is a coward who strikes at the defenseless when he can't reach his actual enemies. This is on him, not you." "But they're looking for me," Carolee cried, looking up at him with tear-streaked cheeks. "First the waitress job, now the bakery. He's burning down my life to draw me out. How many more people have to get hurt? Let me go, Delroy. If I turn myself over to him—" "Don't you ever say that!" Delroy snarled, a sudden, terrifying flash of absolute possessiveness exploding in his eyes. His hands moved from her waist, gripping her face with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "Do you hear me? You are mine to protect. You think offering yourself to a butcher will save anyone? He will torture you for weeks just to send me a video of it." Carolee stared into his stormy eyes, paralyzed by the raw, dangerous emotion radiating from him. The physical proximity was overwhelming. The fear, the adrenaline, the crushing guilt, it all condensed in the heavy air between them, warping into something entirely different, a desperate, burning heat. Delroy's gaze dropped to her trembling lips. The restraint he had been meticulously maintaining for the past 2 days snapped like a brittle wire. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, romantic kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate, fierce, and tasting of salt from her tears and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Delroy's hand slid into her hair, holding her in place as his mouth devoured hers, demanding everything she had left to give. For a fraction of a second, Carolee's mind screamed at her to push him away, to fight the monster who casually executed men on his living room floor. But her body betrayed her logic. The intense, grounding warmth of his chest, the intoxicating scent of his skin, the sheer protective power he wielded, it pulled her under. She kissed him back, her hands sliding up his muscular chest to grip his shoulders, anchoring herself in the center of the hurricane. When Delroy finally broke the kiss, they were both breathing heavily. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed tight, as if fighting a violent internal war. "I will not let anything happen to you," Delroy whispered, his voice trembling with a ferocious, suppressed violence. "I swear it on my father's grave." He slowly pulled back, gently wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The vulnerability in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, tactical brilliance of a warlord preparing for a slaughter. Delroy turned to Luke, who had respectfully turned his back during the exchange, and was staring out the window. "Call the families," Delroy ordered, his voice echoing through the penthouse like a death knell. "Call the Irish, call the Russians, tell them to stay off the streets tonight. Dom, if we mobilize the entire syndicate, the feds will crawl up our asses before midnight," Luke warned, turning around. "I don't care about the feds," Delroy said, walking over to the heavy oak dining table and sweeping the decorative centerpieces off onto the floor with a violent crash. He grabbed a map of the city from his study and slammed it down onto the wood. "Moretti broke the rules. He involved civilians. He went after what is mine." He looked back at Carolee, his eyes dark, dangerous, and utterly resolute. "We are done playing defense," Delroy stated. "Tonight we take his head." Heavy steel deadbolts slid into place with a resounding metallic clatter. Delroy stood in the foyer of the penthouse, strapped into a matte black Kevlar tactical vest, heavily armed and radiating an aura of uncompromising violence. Around him, a dozen of his most elite enforcers checked their weapons, the sharp sounds of magazines clicking into tactical rifles echoing through the modern minimalist space. Carolee stood by the edge of the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The kiss they had shared hours ago still burned on her lips, a chaotic memory that anchored her amidst the escalating madness. Delroy walked over to her, his heavy combat boots silent on the Persian rug. He reached behind his back, withdrawing a compact silver Kimber Micro 9mm from a concealed holster. "Take this," Delroy instructed, pressing the cold metal into her palm. "The safety is on the left side. You keep it on you. If anyone who doesn't have my face tries to come through those elevator doors, you do exactly what you did at the restaurant." "You're leaving me here?" Carolee asked, her fingers wrapping around the familiar textured grip of the firearm. "The penthouse is a fortress," Delroy replied, his tone softer now, reserved only for her. "I have guards posted in the lobby, the garage, and the roof. But my enemies are desperate, and desperate men find cracks in the armor. Lock the bedroom door. Do not let anyone in, not even the maids." "Come back," Carolee whispered, surprising herself with the raw honesty in her voice. Delroy's hardened expression cracked just enough to reveal the man beneath the armor. He leaned in, pressing a firm, lingering kiss to her forehead. "I always come back." Within minutes, the penthouse was empty. The sudden silence was deafening. Carolee checked the safety on the Kimber, her father's voice echoing in her mind. "Always know your exits, Carolee Bear. Always secure your corners." She retreated to the master bedroom, locking the heavy mahogany door behind her and sitting on the edge of the bed, the gun resting heavily on her lap. 5 miles south, the storm had intensified, turning the industrial warehouse district into a flooded, miserable wasteland. Vincent Moretti's base of operations was a sprawling, decommissioned meatpacking plant, heavily fortified and patrolled by cartel-trained mercenaries. Delroy's G-Wagon, flanked by 3 armored black SUVs, cut their headlights a block away, rolling to a silent halt in an abandoned alleyway. "Thermal imaging shows 20 men on the ground floor, 10 on the catwalks," Luke whispered, checking the glowing screen of a tactical tablet. His left arm was tightly bound in a sling, but his right hand gripped a suppressed submachine gun with deadly intent. "Moretti is in the main office on the 2nd floor. He's dug in deep, Dom." "Good," Delroy said coldly, racking the charging handle of his customized M4 carbine. "I want him to know there is nowhere left to run. Breach the loading docks, leave no one breathing." The assault was a masterclass in tactical brutality. Delroy's men didn't bother with negotiations or warning shots. They blew the massive steel roll-up doors of the loading dock with shaped C4 charges. The explosion ripped through the storm, instantly followed by a torrential hail of suppressed automatic fire. Delroy moved like a shadow possessed by vengeance. He breached the slaughterhouse floor, navigating the maze of hanging steel chains and rusted meat hooks. Moretti's mercenaries, expecting a traditional gangland drive-by, were entirely unprepared for a paramilitary siege. Delroy dropped 2 men with precise double-tap shots to the chest before they could even raise their weapons. "Push forward!" Luke shouted over the chaotic din of gunfire, directing their flankers to pin down the men on the catwalks above. Sparks rained down from the ceiling as bullets chewed through the industrial lights, plunging the factory floor into a strobe-lit nightmare. Delroy pressed on, his eyes locked on the elevated glass office overlooking the floor. He could see movement inside, the frantic, panicked pacing of a cornered rat. Back at the penthouse, Carolee jumped as a soft chime broke the silence of the bedroom. She stared at the digital intercom panel mounted on the wall. The camera feed showed the private elevator foyer. Standing there, soaked from the rain, and clutching a black leather medical bag, was Dr. Harrison Miller. Carolee frowned, walking slowly toward the intercom. She pressed the 2-way audio button. "Dr. Miller. Delroy isn't here. Luke is with him." "Carolee, thank God!" Dr. Miller's voice crackled through the speaker, breathless and panicked. "Delroy sent me back. Luke's stitches ruptured during the ride over. He's losing blood fast. Delroy told me to grab the O-negative blood bags from the medical fridge in the guest wing. Please let me in. Carolee hesitated. Her hand hovered over the door release button. It made perfect sense. Luke had been shot mere days ago. Engaging in a firefight would absolutely tear his shoulder open. But as she looked closer at the monitor, a cold spike of adrenaline pierced her chest. Dr. Miller was dripping wet. If he had come up from the secure underground garage where Delroy's men were stationed, he wouldn't be soaked. He would have parked inside. The only way to get rained on was to enter through the civilian street-level lobby, bypassing the security checkpoints. Furthermore, his black leather medical bag looked exceptionally heavy, completely devoid of the bulky shape of IV fluid bags. He was lying. Carolee stepped back from the panel, raising the silver kimber. I can't do that, doctor. Delroy gave strict orders. Nobody comes in. The panic on Miller's face vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, desperate sneer. He reached into his medical bag not for bandages, but for a block of C4 plastic explosive and a breaching detonator. Jimmy hadn't been the only rat. He had just been the distraction. Gunfire shredded the reinforced glass of the second-floor office. Delroy kicked the splintered door off its hinges, diving into the room as heavy-caliber rounds tore through the drywall where his head had just been. He rolled, snapping his rifle up, and fired a sustained burst into the two cartel bodyguards flanking the heavy oak desk. They collapsed in a spray of red, their armor failing against Delroy's armor-piercing rounds. Vincent Moretti, a rat-faced man with a slicked-back ponytail, scrambled backward, his revolver clicking empty as he fired wildly in Delroy's direction. Wait, Dom! Moretti screamed, tripping over a rolling chair and crashing onto the linoleum floor. Delroy didn't say a word. He stalked forward. The barrel of his smoking M4 pointed squarely at Moretti's forehead. You think you won? Moretti wheezed, a bloody, psychotic grin spreading across his face. You think you're the smartest guy in Chicago? You sent your whole army here, right? You left your house completely empty. A fortress is only as strong as the guy holding the keys. Delroy's blood ran ice cold. The keys. Dr. Harrison Miller had the security clearance to bypass the electronic countermeasures. Miller owed millions to underground casinos, debts Moretti could easily clear. Miller, Delroy breathed out, true terror gripping his heart for the first time in his life. He's probably walking through your front door right now. Moretti laughed, spitting blood onto the floor. He's going to bring me that waitress's head in a box. Delroy pulled the trigger. Moretti's laughter ended abruptly. Luke, Delroy roared, abandoning his rifle and sprinting back toward the shattered doorway. We need to go back, now! He didn't wait for his men. He vaulted over the railing of the stairs, hitting the factory floor at a dead sprint. His mind was a frantic, terrifying loop of Carolee's face. He had promised to protect her. He had locked her in a cage with the very traitor he had been hunting. Delroy tore through the flooded streets of Chicago, pushing the G-Wagon well past its limits. Tires screamed against the wet asphalt as he drifted around corners, running red lights, his heart hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer. The 10-minute drive felt like a slow-motion descent into hell. He slammed on the brakes in front of his residential tower, not bothering to park. He drew his pistol and sprinted into the lobby. His two guards were dead on the marble floor, shot cleanly in the back of the head. Miller's work. Delroy hit the override code for the private elevator, his breathing ragged. The agonizing climb to the penthouse took 30 seconds, but to Delroy, it felt like decades. He checked the chamber of his weapon, ready to tear Miller apart with his bare hands if he had laid a single finger on Carolee. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. The heavy mahogany door to the master bedroom had been blown completely off its hinges, smoke pouring out into the hallway. Carolee! Delroy screamed, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. He lunged through the ruined doorway, his gun sweeping the room. The room was destroyed. The massive mirror was shattered and bullet holes riddled the expensive silk wallpaper. Lying in the center of the plush carpet was Dr. Harrison Miller. He was groaning in agony, clutching his right knee, which had been completely blown out by a 9mm hollow point. His suppressed pistol lay kicked into the far corner of the room. Standing 10 feet away, perfectly composed in a two-handed combat stance, was Kara Lee. The silver kimber was locked dead center on Miller's chest. Her hands weren't shaking this time. There was no terror in her amber eyes, only the cold, calculated discipline of a survivor. Delroy lowered his weapon, staring at her in absolute awe. The panic in his chest dissolved, replaced by a profound, overwhelming surge of pride and possessiveness. Carolee kept her eyes on the bleeding doctor, but spoke to Delroy. He tried to blow the locks. I shot through the door. Miller coughed, spitting blood onto the carpet. You crazy bitch. Carolee didn't flinch. She took a slow, measured step forward, the barrel of the kimber not wavering a single millimeter. You burned down Mrs. Gable's bakery. You put an innocent old woman in the hospital. Carolee, Delroy said softly, stepping fully into the room. He walked over to her, gently placing a hand over hers, lowering the weapon. You don't need to do this. You've done enough. She looked up at him, her chest heaving as the adrenaline finally began to recede. Delroy pulled the gun from her hands, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her flush against his armored chest. Carolee buried her face into his neck, closing her eyes as his strong arms secured her in the only safe place left in the city. Delroy looked down at the traitor writhing on his floor. His dark eyes were devoid of mercy. Luke, Delroy said, pressing his comms earpiece, send a cleanup crew to the master bedroom. We have trash to take out. He looked back down at Carolee, brushing a stray lock of hair from her sweat-dampened forehead. The war was over. Moretti was dead, the syndicate was secure, and the traitor had been rooted out. But as he looked at the woman in his arms, the waitress who had saved his life, the woman who refused to be a victim in a world of monsters, Delroy knew his life would never be the same. It's over, Delroy whispered, kissing the crown of her head. You're safe. Carolee looked up at him, the ghost of a defiant Texas smile playing on her lips. I know, but from now on, I'm cooking the steaks and I'm holding a gun. Delroy chuckled, a deep, resonant sound of pure devotion. Whatever you want, my queen, whatever you want. If this heart-pounding mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to smash that like button and share it with your fellow drama lovers. We want to hear your thoughts. Did you expect that massive twist with the doctor, or did Carolee's incredible survival skills blow you away? Drop a comment below and let us know your favorite moment. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling, real-life inspired story of dangerous love, intense betrayal, and shocking vengeance. See you in the next video.